So, Skip, how did you get into all this VR and exposure therapy and this?
I started off in the early 90s. I was a practicing clinician working in brain injury rehabilitation, and very frustrated with the types of tools that we had to work on helping people to recover their cognitive abilities. And one day I had a student who had a brain injury, and he was at break time sitting under a tree, hunched over something, and he was like this. And it was about 1991, and I went over and I go, "Hey, Tim, what do you got there?" And he goes, "It's a new thing. It's a Game Boy."
Okay.
And he was playing Tetris, and he was like a Tetris warlord. He was great at it. And this was a patient really that I couldn't motivate for more than 10, 15 minutes to do traditional cognitive rehabilitation, workbook exercises and so on. But here he was engaged with this game. And he was doing it a lot, and he was showing improvements. He got really good at it. So that started my thinking about bringing game activities into rehabilitation or treatment. And I brought in SimCity, which is a good executive function, multitasking activity. And a lot of my patients really liked it, and they played it a lot. And at the same time, virtual reality came into the public consciousness. This was around 92, 93 now. And I heard about a conference called Virtual Reality in Persons with Disabilities. I said, "Oh, let me check that out." And I went there, and nobody was talking about using it for cognitive rehabilitation or anything. So the next year I wrote a paper and went to the conference and presented it. And then I was a clinician, and so I didn't have a lot of money for the equipment, so I ended up looking for a university position where they have a good computer science program. And I took a postdoc and made friends with people in computer science, and they eventually gave me some equipment, programming time, and we built the lab up. That was in 1995. Around 1996 we started building cognitive-oriented apps, mental rotation, visual spatial abilities, attention processes in VR. And then over the years, new projects emerged, and we ended up, the lab grew, more people came on board, we got funded, and that's the history. But it started from that one patient.
Okay. So what do you think technology can do for us in this area? You have a lot of years experience now, so what's the difference?
I think that, number one, this sort of simulation technology allows us to control the stimulus presentations that are needed for measuring human performance or training or teaching human performance in a variety of areas. So just as an aircraft simulator would test and train piloting abilities, we can now, at a low cost, design virtual reality environments that do the same thing but for clinical purposes. But the other core value, I think, comes in the integration of understanding how games motivate people and bringing that into the mix so that people will be more apt to follow up and adhere to a treatment program if there's a game-based component in it. They'll be more motivated. Just like my former patient with the Game Boy, he was motivated by that game and got better at it. So if we can take that core gaming element and bring it into treatment, we can make a difference.
So the gaming element is important for you. You call it something virtual rehabilitation environment, and we have talked a lot about the virtual part, but what's the gaming part as you see it today?
Well, I think that if you study games and the process of what goes on when somebody plays a game and gets in a flow experience, I think that that theoretical perspective underlies the motivation part, that people like to get immediate feedback on the outcome of their performance. They like to do things that they can't do in the real world. They like manageable challenges that they can overcome. And so if you draw on those kind of elements and think about what goes into a good rehabilitation task, where it's got to be a task that is at a level that the patient can do at their current state. You've got to be able to incrementally introduce challenge and give immediate feedback. I think these things match together really well so that the games can motivate and still fit in the criteria of what good rehabilitation involves.
So you see, so what we see here is that you can bring people into a state of flow or something close to that, but then you need a sort of debriefing. Should that be the therapist, or should that be part of the game, or how do you see that?
I would say that that the technology doesn't fix anybody.
No.
It's simply a tool that, when managed by a good care provider or a clinician, it becomes a powerful tool. But you can't eliminate good clinical expertise from the process. You can develop things that people can work on independently, and they can work on at home without you being there. And you see this a lot with physical therapy, where the amount of physical therapy required for somebody to recover their motor movement after a stroke is a tremendous amount, and it's too much. The required amount of rehabilitation is beyond what a healthcare system would provide for a therapist to be there delivering that. So the therapist should meet with a patient, say, once a week, but be able to have a set of interactive physical games, like using the Kinect.
So the users, the patients, they are motivated to use this, but how do the therapists look at it?
Some, as in any field, you've got neo-Luddites that are resistant to change. They are skeptical. They think that it's going to replace them with exposure therapy. Some clinicians thought the idea of using virtual reality was unnecessary, and I think they had the misconception that it was going to be an automated self-help treatment rather than a tool that they could use to do their job better. So you get some resistance, but on the other side, you also get people that are fabulously excited about it, that see this as finally, we've got some tools to work with that engage people, that there's clinical evidence to support their use, that can make my job even make me more effective as a clinician. So, as in any area, there's a natural skepticism, but there's also an attraction.
How did then the sort of scientific community react towards it?
In the beginning, whenever I would go do talks, up until about 2003, half the talk was based on persuading people.
Oh, okay.
And trying to say virtual reality has these assets, and this is very similar to what we want in rehab or in treatment. Now, I spend 5 minutes talking about that, and people get it now, because I think the game industry, the whole games revolution has brought it into the public consciousness.
So people have sort of matured into this area as well. Yeah. Well, if we go to the digital part, how authentic should it be? How close to reality should it be?
That's a question that comes up in every area. How real does it have to be for somebody to buy into it? And I don't know if there's any one answer. I think that that the graphic realism is important, but think about this. Think about how you relate to cartoon characters. If you watch South Park, you relate to those characters even though they're not an accurate representation of a real person. And I think it's the same thing here. If the simulation has some life to it, some responsiveness. So if somebody can go into this environment and turn their head and look around or navigate in a way and interact with content in a way. It doesn't matter so much what it looks like. It doesn't have to be an exact replica of reality. It can represent reality, and people will get engaged in it. It just depends on what the nature of the application is. Like I think we were talking about some of the ship navigation simulations where it's not that realistic,
No.
but it responds to your action, and people get engaged with it because it represents something in the real world that they can relate to.
So people are very strong in creating pictures and narratives themselves, so this is more like a supportive thing, or how do you see it?
Yeah, I think that people can fill in the gaps. Now, I think there are some applications where if it's more realistic and more like the real world or more fantasy-like, it doesn't always have to be reality, it can be a surreal reality, that maybe you'll get users to buy into whatever it is that you're doing a little bit more and get more engaged in the activity. And the challenge is that we haven't really studied it to the level that we need to understand where that line is that makes it real enough for somebody to suspend disbelief. People have done some of that research, but we're getting to a point with graphics now where it is so, the potential for creating very realistic environments.
More real than real.
More, yeah, hyper real. And so now we need to really study that. Number one, does it attract people to become more engaged? Does it add any training benefit or any treatment benefit or learning benefit if it's more realistic? Will people remember what they did in a simulation more if it's hyper real or if it's schematic? You know, sometimes we remember novel things, and so something that represents reality but in an imperfect way may be more novel, and maybe people will remember that experience more.
So we have to do research and experiments into that. We don't know at the end.
It's a whole new world. I mean, if you look at psychology for the last 100 years, that psychology has been a science. We've studied how people interact and experience the real world. Now we've got to take all that knowledge and do the research for how people experience the digital world.
So we are working with this all over the world, and today we have presented you for a project which is under development in Denmark. How did you find that?
I was fascinated by the approach because it takes a little bit different approach to treating PTSD in combat veterans than the approach we take, but it still was theoretically informed by the same principles, just a little bit different approach.
Yeah.
And I found it fascinating, and I saw the enthusiasm in the room, the people that were involved in that project, and the thought that went into it, and it was impressive. I really felt that that this project mattered.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and that's, you know, when you see that kind of passion, that's always a good thing. You know, that's where innovation comes from.
Yeah, I guess you're right there. So when you look at this application, as you say, it's a little bit different from what you are doing. First of all, it's not virtual reality; it's more like a traditional computer game. What do you think are the benefits of that, and what are the problems within that?
Well, I get the idea that you want to make it so that it's more accessible and not requiring a head-mounted display.
It's also a question of funding, I think.
Yeah, but you know, I would debate that because I think that engagement by the patient in the environment would be enhanced with a head-mounted display. And that's why I asked you, like, what the numbers were in terms of the number of people that might need treatment. It's not like you've got to create 5,000 of these systems to spread out all over the world. You might need 15 or 20 of these systems to service the population that you're aiming for. And the cost for a head-mounted display integrated into the scenario is really minimal in contrast to the benefit that it would add, I believe. So I understand the flat screen is parsimonious and it's an interface, it's a display everybody has. You can distribute this quite easily. But I would do the research, now that you have an infrastructure to study the psychophysiological responses in the environment, I would make that one of my first studies to look at the difference in responsiveness playing it on a flat screen versus wearing a headset and being able to look around.
Great idea, yeah. If we take it at a more general level, how do you see, we could call this serious games, what are the potential for our societies within these serious games and stuff like that? It's a business case in it also.
I think so. Let me think here for a second. I think there's a lot of people that are in the serious games area that come at it from a game perspective, and they're really good at developing games, but whether it targets what you're aiming to either teach or train or treat, you've got to have the expertise. So it's necessarily interdisciplinary.
To negotiate these two rationalities, so to say.
Yeah, like for example, you see education games that, they have a fancy title on them, but they don't really, they're not so good at actually teaching what they're supposed to teach. And so you need to bring in people that are experts in good pedagogy to work together in an integrated fashion, not as an afterthought. And I see that with the health games for health and so on. I think there is a significant business case. If you look at how the market for applications, phone apps has gone, if we could model after that market, clinical apps or educational apps that are a little more than what you can do on a phone. So that, for example, my wife that works with children with developmental disabilities, and we've thought a lot about developing games for the Connect for these kids that target learning how to read, learning the alphabet, things like that. Very basic, but not for marketing it to clinicians, but marketing it to parents. Yeah. So you could download an app. In the future, you'll have everybody's got a big screen, and embedded in that screen will be Connect-like sensors, and it'll be connected through the internet in everyone's home. And children will be able to play physically with game content that trains cognitive abilities, and the parent can download it for $2. And I think that's the direction I think we're looking at it, like from an app point of view. Clinically, that's a whole other story. For applications that really require a clinician to be embedded in guiding the therapy, I think there's a market, but it's got to be easy to access. It's got to be all internet downloadable. I think head-mounted displays will eventually become a commodity display. They're getting better now. They're lighter. They're more comfortable.
We have waited for that for a long time, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, the Kinect, it just came, and we didn't even. Yeah. You were not expecting it or waiting for it. So, okay, technology moves, but at different pages. Yeah. Thank you, Skip. It's great to have you here.
Well, thanks for having me. Thank you.